lot of entrepreneurs want to see a landing page, want to see code being done, because the assumption is they want to tie their investment or spending time of money with an agency to a tangible output.
I mean, my best outcomes so far are when people have done nothing and they have an idea, and I help them frame their idea and understand what is possible.
What's your take on AI? And I feel like everyone's like, oh my God, the cost of development has gotten so much cheaper now.
I don't think it's it's like a red herring. Engineering, if you know what you're doing, is already pretty inexpensive.
When you go to the crux of finding a problem that people are willing to pay money for, it could be a Google form and people will pay you money.
Software is fundamentally like a highway for goods. It is not the goods themselves.
Hey guys, welcome back to Funds and Founders. Today we have on John. You're currently the founder and lead product engineer of StartupLandia, which is what your LinkedIn says. But why don't we do a quick intro, tell people what you're building, what you're working on. I have this joke where I say YouTube retention is 4 to 5 minutes. And so I like to plug everyone in the beginning, and then we'll plug you at the end as well.
Awesome.
So people can reach out, but tell listeners what you're doing, where can they reach out, and who should reach out to you?
Sure. StartupLandia is a small, I tell people we're somewhere in between a venture studio and a traditional dev shop.
Okay.
And I formed StartupLandia because I fell in love with early stage engineering, and I worked closely enough to Bay Area startups that I understood that it's actually probably an unsustainable lifestyle. Like, you can't work at the seed to Series A level indefinitely. It'll just grind you up. And I saw a lot of pitfalls that I saw a lot of founders fall into. And so I felt like I had some super skills around technical recruiting and road mapping and, frankly, like a COTS, commercial off-the-shelf sort of mentality, that I was like, I think founders can build a lot cheaper than what they attack. Like, I'd see people go after a 2 or 3 or 400K funding round and spend it on day one. And I'm like, that's death. You just don't know it. It just hasn't caught up with you yet. And so I built a consultancy, the dreaded the C word, consultancy, because services. And I built a consultancy around what I wanted out of my life and what I thought would be useful for founders. And so now StartupLandia has about 25,000 hours worth of worked for founders in various stages, either venture-backed or self-backed or like SMB sort of product people trying to do a little bit more Silicon Valley style work. I've been a founding engineer. I have a team overseas. I have a designer. I love the design of everyday things. I try to bring very much if you're a human in the wilderness by yourself and somebody just threw this tool at you to solve a problem, could you use it? And I try to help founders think through that. And that's StartupLandia.
Nice. Let's get straight into it. And I think one thing I wanted to ask you was, when is the right time for a founder to reach out to someone like yourself?
I mean, my best outcomes so far are when people have done nothing and they have an idea, and I help them frame their idea and understand what is possible if they have the discipline to go slow, which I think is a really hard thing for people. It's like, we're going to spend more time dissecting assumptions than we are actually working. And 100%. I think a lot of people are like, well, just get to the work and everything will be okay. But they don't understand the duration of work, and they don't understand like the cost volume of work. Like, sustaining a $30,000 burn rate for a year is brutal, right? That's $600,000 without any, actually, I don't know if I did the math right. That's 360,000 without any, without knowing if that's going anywhere. And so I want to help founders basically look at, here's the state of all commercial off-the-shelf tooling. Here is sort of your strategic roadmap, and help them really understand how to use tooling. Like, if you were to open up the documentation and only read the first half of the first page, you would get the 80-20 of how a tool works.
Yeah.
Right? What can you, and if you run that tool in 20 minutes, what is it capable of? Okay. And now you assemble 5 tools together. There is sort of the constraints that you need to work within, right? Every time you find yourself wanting to build new computing technology outside of those constraints, as a founder, you've made a financial mistake. So that's when you got to like reel yourself back into the core problem to be solved. And so that I really like to work with people in that, I have an idea. Here I am drawing it on a cocktail napkin. What do I do next?
Nice.
Sorry, super long.
No, you're good. You're good. Yeah. Feel free to sit back if you want to sit back, whatever you're comfortable with.
This is my business pose.
But the reason I ask is I feel like a lot of people, and you were touching about this, a lot of entrepreneurs want to see a landing page, want to see code being done, because the assumption is they want to tie their investment or spending time of money with an agency to a tangible output. But I think what a lot of people miss is that the work we do in going from thought and idea to here's MVP, that is really important work. And every time I work with anyone, I stress on the fact that, hey, we're going to go through multiple iterations. The first couple weeks is where I need your time and attention the most in figuring out what are we actually building for you, going back and forth on what's important, what actions are you trying to push a user towards, what do you want to see, what kinds of conversions do you want to see on the app. I can build a lot of fluff for you, but that doesn't help you or me. I would rather build you a core product that helps you either make an assumption, validate a thesis, and move on to, let me build on this, or, hey, it's not working, let's figure out a pivot. But I feel like sometimes I've gotten pushback on that from some founders, like, oh, let's start building now. And they want to just like keep building and changing and building and changing, but I don't think they understand that that ends up costing you more time and money than let's just lay it all out, let's talk through it, let's figure out, like you said, break down and understand what are you building, and then go from there.
Yeah. And what's the question? I think it's rooted in management culture that is still kind of like, it's linear management culture, right?
Yeah.
$1 in equals $1 of code out or whatever. Yeah. That won't hold up very well. The analogy of the chessboard and the Chinese king that was like, invent me a new game. And he like tells his whole kingdom, invent me a new game. And somebody, people come in with new games. And anyways, some monk or some person, and I'm butchering the story, but the outcome is what matters. And somebody shows up with the chessboard and chess pieces and explains the game. And the king is like, that's amazing. What do you want as your reward? And the person that showed up with the game is like, well, I want 2 grains of sand that double for every square on the chessboard, right? And the king is like, amazing, right? Of course I'll give you that. Or 2 grains of rice for every square on the chessboard. And by the time you do the math on that and you get to the end of the chessboard, it's like a number that's so big it wouldn't even fit in this room.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of management still lives in sort of like 1930s to 1990s industrial culture where maybe $1 in led to $1 out, and that was okay. But now that we've sort of entered the post-industrial internet age where LLMs exist and where YouTube and Twitch are generating so much data that a one-to-one sort of managerial mentality is just broken, right? Like you need a 10-to-1.
Yeah.
Right? If you put in $1, you need to get 10 out. And most of that, take a look at like the WhatsApp acquisition, right? How many people were at WhatsApp
19.
when it was acquired, right?
18 or 19
Yeah,
people.
so sub 50, and it was acquired for
19 billion.
19 billion. To do that, you must develop an algorithmic approach to pretty much all industrial operations, which means like our job as services providers is to help people who are generally one-to-one managerial thinkers think like, oh, well, 1-to-2 or 1-to-5 and 1-to-10. And I think the problem with like 1-to-20 or 1-to-100 is like, well, these people sat around for 6 months and did nothing but diagram things on a whiteboard.
Yeah.
But that's actually how some of these startups go super huge.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? They take $5 million rounds so they can spend 6 months or 8 months thinking.
Makes sense. One thing I wanted to get your take on is for a founder listening who's early in their journey, maybe doesn't have the cash to work with an agency or trying to bootstrap it, do you have any recommendations or frameworks or processes and just stuff that they could do to help them understand and get closer towards understanding what the product is, what the MVP is, what do they want to build, what do they really want to build? Do you have any guiding principles there?
This is like a trope, but like go sell your thing, right? Everyone talks about software as a service, and all I can communicate just relentlessly to founders is it's a service enabled by software. And so sell the service, even if that means you collecting information in an email from somebody and then crunching information behind the scenes and then delivering that result back to somebody. That's fully acceptable, and sell that to somebody. And if it solves a valid problem, someone will give you $500 or $1,000. And, you know, for reference, I'm much stronger in B2B software. So it's much easier once you've solved a problem for someone for them to give you $500. Whereas like getting a regular consumer to give you $500 is very hard. And I should give a shout out to my wife. She has a class called Etsy Boss, and she sold like $8,000 worth of seats about 3 weeks ago at a $400 price tag. And she's just like killing it, teaching people how to do print on demand Etsy classes. Nice. Yeah. And like, I say that because it's very hard to get random consumers to give you $400, and
we'll link the course for anyone who wants it with.
And so coming back to your question, it's just critical that founders develop that, sell the service, and push software as far out into the future as is humanly possible. And Paul Graham says this. He says do things that don't scale. He also says it is okay to sell services in the beginning, to sell consulting, because you're basically getting paid to learn about your customers. And I think people are really negative on that. And it comes back to fundraising. Your job is to tell the VCs or the investors what they need to hear. It's not to give them every single detail. They want to know that you're in control of the show. And if occasionally you need to sell some services to keep the lights on, that's fine. You're just not building a venture scale business if all you're selling is services.
What's your take on AI? And I feel like everyone's like, oh my God, the cost of development has gotten so much cheaper now. It's so easy to spin up an MVP. I have my opinions on that. But what's your take on that? What's your take on everyone saying that the cost of development is going to become like 0.1x of whatever it currently is?
I don't think it's it's like a red herring. Engineering, if you know what you're doing, is already pretty inexpensive, right? Yeah. Like you and I both run agencies, and when I'm a fractional CTO and I have a good amount of equity in a company, my job is to drive engineering costs to as close as zero as is humanly possible. Yeah. And like 2 years ago, I could drive those costs down so low that engineering is always sitting around with nothing to do. And so you're like, okay, we're going to drive engineering costs down even further. Great. Engineering costs were never really the bottleneck, right? The bottleneck is understanding a problem that someone will pay you for, and creating a user experience that's actually nice enough for somebody to want to keep paying. And I think those are both much higher level
100%.
Sort of bottlenecks. And so whenever someone is like, well, LLMs are, killing off developers or whatever they say, I'm like, I don't think you've ever done this before. Because 2 years ago, none of that was true, and it's still not true, right? Like when you go, like Lenny's podcast, right? I love the Lenny's community. He interviews, I think Jeff Weinstein from Stripe Atlas. And I mean, just like this crazy 3-hour session. And not once did they ever talk about the cost of engineering, right? They talk about, what are your users' first order problems? Because they don't get out of bed for anything that's not a first order problem. Yeah. And like, there's just so many things he talked about that had nothing to do with the cost of engineering. What I do think is true, has been true for a long time and will continue to be true, like Moore's Law, right? The cost of CPU is the quality, the output of CPUs is just increasing at an exponential rate. And that has been true since the first semiconductor came off the line, and I guess it kind of continues to be true. I don't know with M2s and stuff and GPUs, who knows? But the relevant point is that it's a curve on a chart that just sort of keeps growing. And I think with software, the proxy is the complexity of infrastructure, right? As complexity of infrastructure keeps growing, the demand for good engineers who understand that complexity will continue to grow.
Yeah.
And when you bring AI and LLMs onto the scene, these things that we don't fully understand, I think you're creating, exponential increase in the complexity
100%.
of the underlying systems. And so you're telling me that as we have taken complexity, coming back to the chessboard, we're like on the final layer of the chessboard. Complexity is the Marianas Trench. It's the abyss. It's so intense. And you're like, we're entering the most complex phase of technology to ever exist, and we don't need developers anymore. I'm like, I don't understand that. And part of StartupLandia's thesis is that we're not going to hire the most expensive engineers, and we're also not going to hire the cheapest engineers. Yeah. We're going to hire people in the middle of the road who have incredible communication skills and love to build. And there are no battles that are going to be won by searching for the zero-cost engineering resources. And in fact, I'm like, I think all this stuff makes StartupLandia all the more valuable. I have a bunch of awesome full-stack engineers who don't need tickets. You just talk to them for 30 minutes, and they'll go work for 2 weeks and come back to you when they have questions. And that is what matters.
100%.
Sorry, so many details, but you're asking, questions that like get to the heart of what we do.
And I think the reason that's super important, and I see a lot of these videos and people going like, how I built an app and using AI in 60 minutes. I'm like, you built a theoretical piece of software that no one is really going to use or pay for. When you go to the crux of finding a problem that people are willing to pay money for, it could be a Google form and people will pay you money.
That's right.
If it solves the problem.
Services enabled by software.
100%.
Yeah.
If it's a problem that people really have and are willing to pay for, I don't think the software is the limiting factor at that point. To your point, right?
No.
They will pay you. They will wire you money, and you just like slack them and solve the problem. Whatever, right? I'm not good at thinking with analogies.
Web software is fundamentally like a highway for goods. It is not the goods themselves.
100%. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong. I'm not afraid that AI will sort of take clients away because, again, we were talking about this before we started recording. Value prop is more in all of that work, the problem solving, the figuring out what problem to solve, the finding the right problem, finding an ICP, figuring out, okay, how do we solve this problem properly? What are people willing to pay for? Once you figure all of that out, converting that to software is relatively a solved problem, is not too hard. But all of that initial work is where I think value lies, right?
Yeah, and in good user experience.
Yeah.
I think if you let an AI write code and you keep smushing together, AI-driven code that you sort of understand 60%, eventually you're going to get to a code base that you actually don't understand. And creating an amazing user experience there, coming back to the Lenny's podcast, right, where the Stripe Atlas PM, he's like, when we started this, and there's a tweet on Twitter that we should flash when you do the actual thing. I was talking to him about it. They start in like 2012 or something, and he shows me the metrics all the way to like 2020 or 2022. He's like, founders had 2 or 3 or 4 touch points with customer support to get all the way through Stripe Atlas, right? And he's like, I understood that for Stripe Atlas to really go the distance, founder interactions with customer support had to go to 0. And so people, founders, anyone making software, deeply, they do not fully understand how difficult it is to have a self-service UX with 0 bugs operating at scale. It is really, really hard. And that is the layer when code quality it's so important
100%.
Because you might have this tiny little bug in a form. It might be related to a background job in some system downstream in a Docker container, who knows? And like contextualizing that for an LLM is very, very difficult.
100%.
And it's all about what I said at the beginning where, I want to build things for founders where I spend 5 minutes reading the documentation and I use tools only in accordance with the first 5 minutes of that documentation, and we don't drift outside of that box, because that is what is scalable over a 2 or a 3 or a 4 year period. When you go from 100 users to 10,000 or 100,000, and you want to keep that, how many times did they ping customer support? That needs to be a 0. That is non-trivial. And that's not about like, I hired these $15 an hour engineers who were happy to, work as close to 0 as possible. That's just not how that stuff works.
So funny you say
Sorry,
that.
I'm just shamelessly also self-promoting now.
No, yeah. I'm happy.
This is what I do. This is like my entire life is built around this stuff.
The reason I was...
I don't have a day job. There's no going back from the entrepreneurial route, like none.
The story that comes to mind is I'm filing for a Japanese e-visa for my wife and I. And in the last
Japan, by the way,
3 days...
Go to Hakone.
Okay, I'll get recommendations. The last 3 days, I've called their 24/7 customer line 8 times.
Wow. That's not cool.
They had a form that I was using Safari was automatically zoomed out, and I had no place to select the form to submit it. I did call them. They're like, yeah, just click. I'm like, where do I click?
Yeah.
And then I zoomed out.
Yeah.
It was a
because everyone would
issue.
think to zoom out.
Yeah.
No one would think to
Yeah.
zoom out. I'm
And
making
then-
a joke.
No, I know. And then I zoomed out. I was like, oh, so your UI elements are not understanding the density on whatever browser I've opened.
Yeah.
And then I saw the checkbox. I'm like, this is such a random thing.
Yeah. But that's real software.
Upload a photo of a copy of my passport, and it kept throwing me errors. Tried every format they had, errors. Called them, they said it's 2 megabit limit. I'm like, okay, first of all, you've never mentioned that anywhere, but all of my things are less than that. Tried every format from 10 kilobyte to up to exactly 2 megabyte. No solution. And then I just realized, oh, my passport is upside down. Let me rotate it 2 times.
Yeah.
And then it worked, and it auto-filled. I'm like...
Only an engineer who's debugged UI would think to do that. Everyone else would walk.
So random. And I was like, I feel like the Japanese government could make a better website.
Probably.
It's a really shitty
Any
website.
government. It's funny that you say ID verification, because Stripe also apparently now does like identification verification.
ID.me and something, or
some version of that. I think it was like Stripe branded, and I used it like a week ago, and it was flawless. I was like, oh my God, that was amazing. I didn't hate my phone while I'm trying to upload my driver's license to do something. It was verifying my identity for, I want to say, Beehive.
Okay.
Like, you have to verify your identity
to get paid out.
Yeah, and they used Stripe verification. It sent me a text message, took a picture, and everything worked. There was no weird formatting questions, and I was like, Stripe, killing it with understanding, the relationship between weird UX and administration on the web, which is hard.
Yeah. And I think maybe give me your thoughts on this. For a founder starting out early in their journey, have an idea, some traction, whatever, at what point should they start focusing on caring about UX? Because I feel like maybe it's something that doesn't need to happen from day one, but there's probably some inflection point. In your opinion, at what part in the journey do you think that becomes, oh, I got to now start considering UX and not just pushing stuff out?
I mean, it's interesting because if you think purely from a visual design point of view, probably high quality visual design can wait for a long time. But when you think about UX from the sort of customer experience point of view, and I forget the model, but it's like the
And just to clarify for anyone listening, we're talking about what does their journey and experience actually is on the site versus how does it look? Like, are you segregating these in terms of like design aesthetic is slightly different from actual journey, or is it one and the same for you?
Design aesthetic is definitely different. I would say, to me, I think about UX as like, there's that chart, like the adoption curve, right? And what you want to think about is like, it's a business, right? You're a businessman or a person, a woman, anything, I don't know, a business human. Your job is to solve a problem and to take money from somebody. And the foundational part of that is a negotiation with another person. And every time we negotiate, we set an expectation. And so the UX needs to match the expectation level that was set during the negotiation. And any business person, I think, would understand that supply and demand is everything, right? And so if you've negotiated for a $10 experience, you don't really want to deliver a $15 experience because eventually you'll go broke.
Yeah.
You want to deliver like a $9 or an $11 experience, right? If you deliver a $9 experience, you make $1. And if you deliver an $11 experience, you paid $1. So I think you need to think of UX in terms of what is the expectation with the customer and what do I need to deliver to make them happy? What do I need to deliver to make them refer me to other people? And that is like, if we come back to your analogy of you just crunch something and Slack them the answer, maybe their expectation was just to get it by 3:30 on Thursday and they didn't care the format.
Yeah.
Or maybe Friday morning they had to give a brief to somebody, so they were expecting a one-page screenshot that looked nice that they could just put up on screen real quick to show somebody. And I think it's like that's the UX to focus on.
I like that.
And then every time somebody says, well, we'll just use design to make it pretty later, I'm like, I think I just heard a kitten get run over by a semi, right? Yeah. Like, the design is not a process to make things look better or worse. Design is a process to understand people's problems and come up with efficient solutions to those problems. And
I like that. I like the way you frame that.
These are not things that I'm thinking about for the first time in this session.
Yeah.
But I also don't know how to communicate them for my business professionally. So it's kind of a weird paradox. If I like talk in person, I know what I have to say. But if I go to write it down, like for a landing page, I'm like, oh, look, I just wrote a bunch of gibberish.
Maybe you should work with Garrett. But in your experience, you've worked with a bunch of startups, a bunch of founders. What's one thing you think that the founder gets wrong when you start working with them on building it? Like, maybe not wrong, maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it. What's something that you see a lot of founders doing repeatedly that's avoidable early in the journey?
I don't know. I don't have a lot of repeats necessarily of mistakes. I think in consumer, I built an app for a couple of gentlemen and they thought they would hire an agency to do Facebook ads. And they didn't really listen to me about the whole, like, you need to just find a little hook where you sort of broadcast something to your user base and they take an action and they broadcast that action back. And until you have that little feedback loop, don't scale out your app because you just don't know what people would want. And they didn't really listen to me too much, and they had a huge spend and eventually had a very low user base. And then I think the other time that a founder kind of spent a lot of money and I would say kind of borderline failed was when they built an app when they still really needed to be on web. And I tell this to people, and this one's actually quite hard to explain. You need, like, an app, the refresh rate of an app IDE is really low. The feedback cycle of deploy to an app store is really low. The feedback cycle of a consumer downloading an update is even slower. And so app development is generally very slow. Even if you're using React Native or Flutter, whatever, it's still super slow when
there's pieces you can't immediately control.
Exactly. And deep down, you're building business, you're iterating on business logic that is still fundamentally a client-server problem that is better solved in HTML so that you can just understand, what does this background job need to do? What does the feature need to do? What is the general sort of shape of the API? Even if it's a kind of a crappy web experience, then once you understand the web experience and you have the APIs correctly built, apps are fundamentally about UI and distribution at scale. And so I've tried to coach people, like, don't build an app until you actually do this in the browser and it works for 100 people or 1,000 people. And maybe you don't even need UI. Maybe it's a fully SMS email-based experience, especially with a lot of business services. Like, you'd be shocked. You just need some paperwork to go back and forth. You don't need UI for your first 500 clients. It comes back to that. It's a contract negotiation.
100%.
What did they expect from you? What were they willing to give you? how well did you deliver on that?
I like the web analogy you made because, again, making an app, hypothetically, let's say I could build you an app in a week. App Store, iOS, I don't remember Play Store's timelines. iOS, at least a week to 2 to review your app, assuming there's no issues. It'll go live. You push changes, a day, 2 days to review, to push the change. Now you have people on various versions of your app.
Yeah.
You can force an update, but then when you force an update, you got to maintain session. Maybe you can maintain session because of whatever update you're being pushed. Now the person's logged out of the app. They may not ever log in again. There's so much friction when you talk about the journey here.
Yeah.
That what is the upside, right?
None.
To your point, on a browser, a lot of browsers, most of the stuff you can do on an app, you can do on a browser. There's very few things that feel clunky in a browser that would feel better on an app. To your point, solves a lot of use cases. But I have so many founders I work with who are like, I need an app. I need an iOS app. Like, I'm happy to build it for you.
You will need an iOS app. But like to iterate on your business logic, you really want to do that with the web and the console and 100 test users and all that stuff.
And we haven't even talked about payments and the 30%. I don't know if...
I mean, that's insane. And at this point, even most of the apps I use, they're free apps provided by large companies.
Yeah.
They're not actually apps that I use because I want to use that app.
Yeah.
They're not, the apps themselves are not the businesses.
Yeah. Random sidebar. I was reading an article this morning. I think Epic won the lawsuit with Google for the Android Play Store thing. So Epic can have their own app store on Android phones now. And like that changes the whole dynamic of it.
Yeah.
Now, how many platforms do you want to start catering to? And so there's so much like nitty gritty there. But
and like, what is the, coming back to Epic, what is the depth of their technical bench, right? It's huge.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It's like you're on day one of, I want to become a professional basketball player. And you're like, I'm going to behave just like the Olympic dream team. I mean, yes, in terms of how you train, but also you're not going to believe that you're at that level yet until you've put in the time to understand how to do that.
Yeah, I like that. When you're working with founders, how do you guide them towards picking a platform and picking your initial, and maybe you partially answered this right now, but what's your recommendation there to people listening on how should you decide where to build, which platforms to cater to, and sort of how to cater to your ICP?
Like which tech stack?
Not tech stack per se, but like we're talking about like browser versus iOS app versus Android app versus Slack interface, or like there's so many ways to interface with customers that how do you have any frameworks or suggestions on how to figure out, okay, what should my first touch point be? Like, is a Slack app enough? Is a browser app enough? Can I do Google? Like, do you understand what I'm trying to?
Yeah.
Maybe I haven't framed it the best way, but.
I mean, my process is pretty simple where usually people have some version of what they want. I'm like, all right, the first thing we're going to do is convert whatever it is you want to like a document in GitHub. I like to use their bulleted markdown.
Yeah.
I think is really useful. Like, it's just like, we're going to make this just a linear stack of to-dos, and I'm going to help you understand the sort of, a lot of all of this is education, right? I'm going to help you understand the cost versus precision versus like learning factors, right? And so we're going to just start on the low cost, high learning, and we're going to move to the sort of more precise, sort of less learning oriented, higher cost stuff. And I try to put them in control as much as possible. Like, I try to make a really clear case and give them ownership of the decision-making process. Like at the end of the day, I serve founders, and I'm getting a lot better at picking founders who aren't just like, hey, go chop wood, right? They're like, hey, what trees should I cut down? I'm like, okay, here's what you can sell. Here's what's easy to cut down at first. Here's the shape of your land. Here's where you can bring a tractor into the land to pick up wood. So we're going to start in this tiny area, and that'll unlock all that. And, the two skills that I continually get wrong that I know are like the true skills is like understanding the nature of who you want to sell to. Like I get that wrong all the time, and then I forget the other one. I'll come back. It'll kick me in the face
Yeah.
tomorrow, and I'll remember it.
I think there's a lot of stuff that I do just to add on to that. When I'm working with founders, I first try to establish, okay, what are you looking for, right? How blunt are you comfortable with me being? At the end of the day, this is your product, your app.
Yeah.
I'm happy to build it for you, right? But
We
there's
make
exactly.
most of us are incentivized to take money and not push back.
Yeah. And so I asked them on my first call with them, this is even before they've agreed to work with me, like, hey, I can be as blunt as you want me to be, or I can be just as not like push, I don't know what the word for that is, but like I can just agree to what you're saying.
Defer.
Yeah. And I tried to establish that before, and I give them the caveat saying that, hey, my experience has made me think about certain things certain ways. I'm probably not the expert in whatever we're talking about. Like I'm building this app for someone, and we're talking about like gamification and like human psychology of like how they want to make that decision and sort of what he's trying to do with the app at that point. And I'm like, I have thoughts on this. I have opinions on this. I'm going to go look at apps that do this really well and come back with ideas. But just FYI, this is again, based on my experience, my opinions and advice is going to be catered a certain way. That's obviously not the 100% the right answer all the time, but I'm happy to come to the table with those with you and discuss them. And maybe they're shit ideas, and you can tell me they're shitty ideas, and we'll throw them out. But I caveat this and say that, hey, at the end of the day, this is your app. You have to sell this. This is your product. You have to like what we're building. You have to agree with what we're doing. And I can come to the table with ideas, options, and everything, but just understand this and just tell me, hey, how far do you want my bullshit meter to go? Like, are you willing for me to be like, hey, I don't think that's a really good idea. Here's why I think it. I will give you case studies and references of why that's not worked in the past. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong, and I'll still build it for you. But I think establishing that and understanding who you're working with has really helped me sort of be more successful with delivery, right? And,
Yeah, absolutely.
have you seen, in your experience, have you seen founders who come hell-bent with a vision and are just like, I'm going to do this, irrespective of what you tell me is good, bad, or whatever references you give me? Like, they just come into the thing and we're just going to do this, and then it doesn't work out. And do you see people having that sort of rigidity, or?
I do, and I hate to say it tends to come from the more technical, venture-backed, or like the founder who's very capable making and has venture money is usually the least interested in talking about anything. And so I have actually come to understand that like some venture-backed technical founders are a very bad fit, right? Like I do really well with operations and marketing people who want me to run design and engineering, whether they're venture-backed or not. Like when you're asking the question, I'm like thinking of all the times when people really didn't want to talk, and I'm like, yeah, and they all had, $500K to a million or $2 million, and they were 0% interested in any kind of outside conversation, and a lot of them just run out of money within 18 months, and then that was sort of the lead up to the end of COVID venture funding sort of drying up. And now we're back into I sort of think like the Warren Buffett world where, you get some seed money, but you really got to build a business. And then it's more like private equity sort of acquisitions. Oh, you actually need to have a business that has EBITDA and has real fundamentals going for it.
And this is probably just a question I have for you, but when you're working with founders who don't have a solid business model or a value prop sort of figured out when they come to you, are you helping them figure that out as well? Do you tell them to go figure that out before they come back? Because I feel like those things are necessary to do before I even start writing code. Like I feel like if you don't have all those things figured out, you're probably too early. So how do you work with that? What advice do you have for people in that stage?
It just depends on their comfort level for like really weird, uncertain outcomes, and whether or not they're in the business or the consumer space. I think that if you're going to be in the business enterprise space, you pretty much have to have a business model because you're not going to build a large enterprise app that no one's paying for. But when it comes to consumer, there are lots of reasons why solving a problem first and gaining momentum with a large group of people without a clear business model is okay. And I don't think that the natural answer is, well, you'll just sell ads at some point. I think that is a really difficult thing to pull off post Facebook. I think that the LLMs are going to beat up Google badly, and ad-driven business models are going to be really difficult to sustain. Like, maybe your podcast could sustain an ad-driven business model, but that's because you didn't take $100 million in venture financing. Yeah. But once you take $100 million or $50 million in venture financing, you have to have some other way to make money. So I think in consumer space, it matters less, but it's also like a conversation with the founder, right? Like, to your point, I'm really clear about talking about everything, right? Hey, you have no business model. Are you comfortable, rolling the dice with 50K or 100K? And if the answer is yes, and I feel like I've been honest about where we're at, I'm like, hey, great, we'll keep going.
Makes sense.
And it's all about expectations, right?
100%.
Everything is a contract. It's a negotiation. What do I want? What does the founder want? So on and so forth. And when it comes to enterprise founders, I want equity now. So I am driving into conversations where they want me to be a CTO. I want to be with you 2 years from now. I want to help make sure nobody comes into the picture and complicates engineering.
Makes sense. How do you think about those arrangements? What does that arrangement look like when you come in as a fractional CTO? What's the split of work? How is equity given versus cash for dev work and stuff?
It's like a spectrum, right? A CTO's job is to make long run decisions, in my opinion, that enable the founder to get what they want. And so I don't think a CTO should get some money up front, some cash, and people doing the work should get a lot of cash up front. And if you consider that a CTO on the open market could be 3 to 600K, right? Plus, depending on anywhere from 5 to 40 or 50% equity. I don't know. I charge tiny fractions of that. My goal is to have, am I 1/5 the price of all that? I want to collect 5 or 10K cash a month to be a CTO, plus really attractive developer hour sort of numbers or design hour numbers. So what businesses can support a $15,000 a month or a $20,000 a month burn rate? You need to be able to support that for 18 months, right? My job is to make that possible, maybe earn 1% a year or, 1% for that first year and then 0.5% of equity every subsequent year.
Yeah.
So, and, one of the things I coach people to really think about is that you kind of want your developers, you want to capture their peak, 80 hours, maybe 100 hours a month is their peak.
Yeah.
Capture that and don't overwork
100%.
And make sure that they're not all stressed out and just do that indefinitely.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of funny ways that I can I think you can cut down the burn rate. And, I want a little equity for that and I want a little cash and,
Nice.
What's the market? Good CTO could be a lot of money.
Yeah. And the reason I ask is I feel like, again, I think this goes back to, hey, I want bang for buck. I want return on my investment.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there are dead times in development.
Yeah.
Not every day is banger features, hard hitting work. But then sometimes I've worked with some founders who will try to come up with busy work because they're paying for 40 hours a week and they want 40 hours.
Exactly why we don't do 40-hour weeks.
Yeah.
I try to sell variable between 60 and 120 hours a month. And look, if there's no work, go sell. It's totally, and I think a huge mistake that founders make, huge pitfall, right? Oh, I need a CTO. So I'm going to hire this dude right out of college who has no experience actually delivering business results, but they're really smart and they're willing to work forever, right? Or I have an experienced CTO who doesn't necessarily want to write a lot of code anymore.
Yeah.
And founders will hire one of those two people and they'll either underhire on the business side by hiring a fresh college grad, or they'll overhire a full-time CTO And either way, it's a terrible use of resource over an 18-month period. Like, I'm trying to be on-demand services. When you don't have work, okay, we go on to our other projects, right? Like, I've had between 4 and 8 projects going on at any time in the past 3 years. It's my job to keep my team fully engaged, founder's job to sell, and we sort of meet in the middle,
100%.
being honest about like what we're doing with time and whatever. And my guys are also really good at logging time, right? Like, you go in and read the logs, and it'll be like, oh, I spent 0.48 hours doing this thing, and like 25,000 hours, and you can go through our logs and just look. Any point in time, you're like, oh, I understand what they were doing and why in that moment. It's so important. It's a time-based business. Founders podcast, right? He's like 2 of the most common themes in the Founders podcast. It's not that they want to be successful, but they hate losing, right? Yeah. And the other one is that all these really successful people or successful entrepreneurs are like, from day 0, I'm going to control costs, right? And in the information economy, time is an incredible cost, right? If you can do something in 80 hours a month or 60 hours a month, you should be trying to control that down to 60 hours, which means you need to keep track of time.
I like that.
Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, I like it. I think
these are the things that power my life.
The reason, again, I think we're talking about this before we hit record. Part of the reason of me starting
we push record?
I hope so.
Because I'm not saying this again. People will sometimes be like, dude, say that thing you said again. And I'm like, what? I'm having an ice cream. Whoa.
What did I say? I think there's so much complexity to being an entrepreneur that gets really hidden in big stories and funding announcements and all this stuff. And there's so much that goes into just building a good business that is not touched upon a lot. And like, all these things that you're talking about are super important to the journey, right? It's very important to know how to build, what is this going to cost? How do I structure the team? How do I build a good team? We know we haven't even talked about culture, brand. Like, there's so many things that
developer recruiting.
Yeah. I've had some.
We do a whole other podcast on that.
Yeah, I've had some good and bad hires, but and I think it also stems from like when I first started out at the agency, I had a big contract, and I was like, I just want to service it so I don't lose it, and so I probably hired some people that, in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have hired, or maybe I should have waited and sort of done a little more screening before I made an offer, right? And also employment agreements in India are like pretty intense. Like, it's not at will employment. So if I hire someone, it's really hard for me to fire someone. But anyways,
I have done a good job of navigating that. So like, my whole crew, everybody is an independent contractor in places where they can be independent contractors. And then my job is just like, I commit, hey, I'm going to get you between 100 or between 60 and maybe 140 occasionally when it's like really push hours a month. And then that's been my job for the last 5 years, is to keep that pipeline stacked. And with the exception of this summer, I've done a pretty good job of that.
Nice.
My crew has made a lot of my crew is generally wealthier where they live than where I am.
100%.
It's hard to be wealthy in America right now.
100%.
You got to make a lot of money.
I mean, I was talking to Justin about this on Sunday, and I think there's a world where my wife and I spend 6 months here, 6 months in India, or 6 months in Asia.
Yeah.
Just because I feel like the reason people glorify and come to the U.S. is not what it truly, like, daily life here is, in my point of view, not as comfortable as...
No, it's not comfortable at all.
As it can be, and it is in India and any Asian, Southeast Asian country, right? So, I mean, I have my opinions there.
I have lived in Japan and China. Japan has kind of intense work culture. I feel like China was a little more Latin in a sense. Like, when it's a bank holiday, no one's around.
Yeah.
You know, like when there's a 2 weeks of holiday, like, don't expect to get anything done. Don't call people up. Where's my stuff?
Yeah.
You know, it's very relationship driven, and people do their work, but they also do it according to their sort of needs and principles.
Yeah.
Can be hard for Americans, like where I signed a contract, I want my stuff. It's nuanced, man.
Are you a big Twitter person or no?
Twitter?
Yeah.
I mean, I follow a lot of people on Twitter. I think there's incredible content. Twitter in the last 6 months is like an explosion of things I can't understand if, I don't know, is this stuff true? Is it not? It's just like too much content. So like find myself a little bit like filtering it a lot. But I think there's incredible content on Twitter. What do you got for
the
me?
reason I ask is
SpaceX on Twitter is insane. Like
I haven't even
the
followed.
videos and the rocket launches.
Oh, that stuff.
And,
They caught the rocket
yeah,
yesterday.
it was insane. Like,
The reason I said you were talking about like life in Japan and China, and I think yesterday, 2-3 days ago, I saw a tweet, and it says, "I'm shocked. After living in Japan for over 2 years, I recently visited the USA with my wife. It made me realize that the USA is dysfunctional in so many ways and has such a low quality standard across the board." When I saw this tweet, it had 14 million impressions. It has 47 million now.
wow.
And it's just basically shitting on the U.S. And I'm like, and I mean, there are good and bad sides to living in the U.S., but every time someone from India asks me, oh, I want to come to the States, do this, do that, I'm like, really evaluate why you want to do this. Because life here is not what you think it is. Like, life here is very different than what is glorified and why people come to the States and, oh my God, I want to come here, earn money. Yeah, you can make more money here, but with stuff changing in India, my recommendation is you can make a really good salary in India now. Like, the disparity is really low, the pay disparity. Like, 50K in India is like 450, 500K in the US. Like, the lifestyle is there's no comparison.
Yeah.
But no, it's just random.
I mean, I feel compelled to say that I lived overseas for all of my 20s.
Yeah.
And now I feel very strongly about making life in the United States work for myself.
Yeah.
I don't want to just like blanket. I don't want to make the blanket statement that life in America has gotten unlivable. It's definitely difficult, and it's harder than, like, it's a free market economy with so much success that you see where capitalism isn't necessarily the answer to certain types of social and political problems, but you see those problems because of how evolved the capitalist economy is in America. And a lot of the places where life is easier are more state-sponsored economies, and they haven't had to come to grips with the fact that capitalism can't solve some of these problems. And I think people overlook that really fast, right? Like, America is the pointy end of the spear when it comes to what can the free market provide in terms of economic surplus, and also, in a weird way, quality of life, which has become like a disquality of life. Like, when you look at like the industrial agriculture or other things that were like incredibly good business outcomes, but some of the underlying sort of things were not so good. And so I'm like, I came home after living overseas. I'm like, I want to make it work here. I want to understand how to do these things.
Yeah.
And part of that was being an entrepreneur, taking control of my own life. And, you know, it's easy to be upset with America, but it's another thing to do something about, like, well, how would you build your life here? Right.
Yeah. Just being conscious about what that life is for you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty important. We'll probably cut this one question out depending on how we edit it. But if
This
you had a
question or a new?
no, what I'm going to ask you. If I'm able to get the Japan visa and I go for 7 days, what's your recommendation on stay in one city? If yes, which city, or like do a couple things, or?
So 7 days is really fast. I think it depends on what you like. Tokyo could eat up 7 days. Hakone is a very interesting onsen area. Like, you know, Japan sits on faults, so there's a lot of amazing onsen, like hot springs. If you like that kind of culture, Hakone is amazing. I think in Kyoto, there's a handful of the oldest businesses in the world that are still running. Businesses that were like started back in like, I don't know, 2 or 3 or like 1,000, I don't know, like started like 1,000 years ago, that are still continuous. And so that's like on my list of things to go back and see. I think going to Hiroshima and to some of the blast centers of the nuclear bombs is an important, like, it's an important social experience, because we see war in the press, and I'm prior military, by the way. I've been deployed to Afghanistan and Persian Gulf. We see war, and we think of it as this natural way to solve problems. And I think that if it's okay to take that approach, but I think you should expose yourself to the realities
100%.
of what that outcome was.
100%.
Because if war is your go-to for solving problems, we have huge problems.
Yeah.
You know, and I think those monuments are a really good testament to like, maybe we solve problems this way, but maybe that's not a pattern we want to fall into forever. And Japan is one place where you can still do that. And I think that's really powerful. And also, you know, a side note, you know, a ginkgo tree?
No, I don't know.
There was a couple ginkgo trees that were within like, I don't know, like few kilometers of the blast radius, I think in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, that actually lived.
Okay.
And they came back to life after like not came back to life, but they continued to grow like 5 years later. And
Nice.
I'm just like, that is an amazing testament to what the animal and biological world is capable of.
Okay, sweet. I'll check those things
And
out.
Japan has incredible food. Like you can't go wrong in Japan.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm
no.
blowing up the duration of this.
No, it's
I have no
nice.
idea
It's
how
nice.
long we've even been in here.
And
I haven't looked at myself, nor have I looked at time.
That's good. We'll tell you after. But no, I think that was great. I do a couple of things towards the end where I'll ask you a bunch of questions and just rapid fire and just sort of throw answers at me. One thing I like getting from everyone is, do you have 3 resource recommendations for someone building, someone early in their journey? Books, podcasts, YouTube videos, blogs, whatever.
I've said Lenny's podcast multiple times. I think if you really want to understand
Lenny, come on my show.
Lenny Rachiski.
You know, I was just saying, Lenny, come on my show.
Yeah, definitely Lenny. And bring me on your show, even though there's no chance of that happening. I think if you want to learn from incredible PMs who have to do this day in and day out, there's just like unbeatable. I don't even know what I learned at my business school. I'm like, I don't know. You could just listen to all of Lenny's podcasts and learn a ton. I think the David Senra's Founders podcast is incredible. I think Sam Parr's Copy That, which is a 2-week copywriting class, is incredible. He just sends you PDFs every day that you write by hand. Like the amount of times that I hear of founders, they jump to the call to action. They have not spent enough time talking about the benefits. If you're a founder and you try to sell people things who have not already internally convinced themselves that it's a good purchase, you're wasting time. And you're devaluing your brand in their eyes. The probability of them coming back to you in the future is so low. Spend time learning about copywriting, spend time learning about the structure of good copywriting, and understand that when you talk to people, it's still copywriting. Don't get up there and say, "Hi, I'm John, the founder of X." That's what everybody says. It doesn't deliver any value to anybody. And I think Heaton Shah on Twitter has a lot of good counterintuitive observations. He was the founder of Kissmetrics.
I haven't heard his name. I'll look him up.
Meditation. I think meditation and physical fitness are critical. I don't know who said it. Someone on Twitter was like, I don't know. I don't remember what they said, but it was something about like not taking care of your health is like purchasing the bullet train to the afterlife. Like, and it might be a gold-plated bullet train, but like the chances of getting to 70 and your children not knowing you and you not knowing yourself are really high. So like, take care of yourself physically, however that's possible. I think Peter Attia here in Austin, incredible resource.
Peter Attia, come on the show.
Yeah, Peter Attia is insane. Zone 2 cardio. I mean, Zone 2 cardio is basically the fountain of life.
Yeah, I like it.
And learn to cook and learn to do dishes, because I think a lot of people don't cook because they're like, oh my God, my kitchen is now insane. Learn to cook efficiently. Like, use just a few things so that when you're done cooking, you don't have to clean your whole kitchen. Like, don't learn from cookbooks. Just learn some basic theory about oil and spices and just cook with very minimal stuff. But like, eat grass-fed protein and organic produce and off the farms and take care of yourself and cook and all that stuff.
It's funny you say cooking. When I first started cooking, when I came to the States, I would call my mom and be like, hey, tell me this recipe. She'd be like, oh, does it smell like the dish? And I'm like, what instruction is that? Like, she's like, no, does it smell like the dish when I make it? I'm like, no. She's like, okay, put a little more of that. I'm like, that's not a set of instructions. Like,
it's principles though.
Yeah, but yeah. And so like, I mean, now it's started to make sense. And now I understand that, hey, the cooking process, spices cook, blah, blah, blah. But like, when she first, I was like, I can't just like, it doesn't smell like anything. That means, okay, something's not cooked yet, or you maybe added something too early or too late. It has to smell like the thing.
Yeah.
And when it does, you know you're on the
a
right
great North
path. And
Star.
so I'm like, okay, interesting.
Except I don't try to cook any ethnic dishes because I'm like, I could never compete with someone's grandma. Like the amount of tribal knowledge that, elders have about cooking can be insane.
It's funny you say grandmas. Last night I was reading something, some store in New York City doesn't have a chef or a cuisine. It just has rotating grandmas.
No, it's in London.
The thing said it was New York. Oh, could be. Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I met a gent in Mexico a few years ago on an offsite for my team, and he ran an Italian restaurant in Chelsea in London. I think it was called like Nonna's or something. I forget, but it was basically this. They just brought in rotating grandmas from Italy.
Yeah, okay. Could be. Yeah, I mean.
But he could have expanded by now, or someone could have copied him.
Yeah.
It's a good idea.
I like asking every guest, what's your support system?
I don't have a great one right now. This year has been brutal. My wife is also an entrepreneur, and we talk a lot. I'm weirdly skeptical of like professional therapists. I think it can, like I've had some that were great, and I think it's very difficult to, like if you don't know a person's reference point worldview, taking their feedback on yourself, I think is a very slippery slope, because our worldviews have a huge impact on the nature of positive and negative, right and wrong, who are you, and how all that matters. And I've had interactions with therapists where I just don't know who they are as people, and it's very expensive. And so this year mostly has been about physical fitness, not packing my schedule too much. Also, coming to Austin helped me a lot because it gave me a much broader social outlet. You could argue that Austin is a better fit for me than San Francisco. So
nice.
Like that's helped a lot. I joined the Red Fridge Society, which is a kind of a premium.
Chris, sponsor the podcast.
Yeah. Chris Taylor is awesome, by the way. Like if you can become a Red Fridge member, do it. It's been great. That has really helped. Just having a place to go to full of other people, going out, events, getting a lot of cardio. And I have, to a certain degree, told myself that I need to be capable of being my own counsel. So I spend a lot of time like writing my own thoughts and thinking about what matters and why and how do I deal with that. And I think like learning self-love is definitely really important. You need to be able to love yourself. You need to be able to love the people you're close to. And if you're, in the self-hate zone, which I think a lot of founders might come into in certain moments, myself sometimes, you need to find why you're there and how to get yourself out of that. And that is, I don't know, if you believe that we are intact and capable of evolving without any external stimulus, which I do. External stimulus is great, but also if you're stranded in the woods, you'd have to solve your own problems. Listening to your internal voice is critical. Yeah. Data is great, but like humans were given emotions and instinct because at the end of the day, all those data points add up to such large numbers that you cannot pinpoint an answer, right? Emotions are the summary of all of that underlying data, and collecting enough data and then trusting in your instincts to give you the right feedback and following through on that, I think has been really critical for me.
I like that. I do this bit in every episode where I'll ask, what do you mean?
A bit is supposed to be funny, right?
No, I do this segment. Sorry, no, it's not funny. I'll ask you a question for my previous guest, and then I'll ask you to give me a question for whoever my next guest is. So your question is, what is the one consistent thing your business needs to do right now that you're not doing, and why aren't you doing it?
I feel like I am doing it. The consistent, like my business has seen well over almost 3 million in total sales that I've done by myself and executed by myself. My rock bottom is when I'm not socially engaged enough. It's hard to keep the pipeline going. Yeah, and 100%. The fact that I'm sitting here and I'm in Austin and I've seen a plus 2,000% increase in members reached on LinkedIn from content work this year. Like I'm doing the things I need to do. The other thing I'm probably not doing while I'm doing some of this more outgoing stuff is like, I'm not spending as much time in technical tool land as I used to. So like maybe at some point that catches up with me. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Okay. My 2 cents on the technical tool stuff is I feel like there's so much going on that there's always going to be a better tool to use. Mm-hmm. But my take on that is for 95% of use cases, a tool that gets the job done is the tool that works. It doesn't need to be the best version of that tool or stack or whatever, right? Like that, because I was battling with this a couple of weeks ago. It was like there's so much AI stuff happening, and I feel like I'm not aware of everything. But then at the core of it, I was like, so why do I even need to be? If I have a problem, I go find the solution, I implement it, great. Something breaks, there's a better tool.
Use it.
When I go to fix it, maybe at that point I switch out the tool. But until then, if the job is being done, does it really matter that it's being done by something that was a year old versus, probably doesn't, right? So
Should you have to learn something for 6 months before it becomes useful? No.
yeah. What's your question for my next guest?
I'm very interested in education of my children right now. So it's like, where can I really go to explore use cases of the outcomes from different types of schools to understand that? Like there's the Magellan School here in town. There's charter schools. Apparently the whole,
Have you heard of
vouchers is about to become a thing. What's that?
Have you heard of Alpha?
Uh-uh.
It was
Oh,
started
it's
by
like the high
founder-
school?
No, it started by the Trilogy founders.
Huh.
But
There's
yeah,
also
no.
University of Austin. There's some interesting
Yeah,
stuff here.
yeah.
Mostly I'm like, because I had a kind of a bad, I was not a good student, and I didn't do anything useful in my life until after college, and I became motivated to learn things. And I want to understand for my own children how to surround them with the right types of resources. And I feel like just being like, just go to this random public school. I'm like, I don't know. Public schools are they really adapting to the internet of tomorrow?
I don't think
I don't know. So I'm like, my question is like, where can I go to learn more of this and to be in a greater degree of community with like data and information and.
Nice. The Alpha School was founded by, I think, one of the Trilogy founders.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know this. I don't know.
I don't know what Trilogy is. Like Trilogy Capital?
No, Trilogy is a really big consultancy that started in Austin.
Oh, cool.
And so like a bunch of people from early Trilogy are now CEOs across all the big Austin companies.
Oh, wow.
So it's sort of like, PayPal Mafia, but like the PayPal of Austin, in my understanding, is Trilogy.
Was Chris from Red Fridge, did he work there? He told me he worked at one of these old school, they were one of the first companies to get things going. And
Not that I know off the top of my head. But like the CEO of Indeed right now was early at Trilogy, and then there's a bunch. So the Trilogy founder started this thing called Alpha, where it's like entrepreneurship-based schooling.
Wow.
Kids choose their classes. If you want to do an AP course, you go build your curriculum and then learn it.
I mean, Austin is so smart. When people are like, is Austin the baby to San Francisco? I'm like, that question doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Austin is so smart.
Yeah.
So smart.
I feel like the one thing I've noticed about Austin is everyone here is, doesn't matter what you're doing, what you're building, but having a balanced lifestyle is more important to people here than like I've gone to SF New York and I see people on the grind all the time. 100
like AI houses where they're like, well, we'll just work 20 hours a day.
Yeah.
I'm like, good luck 2 years from now.
Yeah.
When you like hate your life and you're like, why can't I have any love? Because you need time to have a relationship.
100%. And yeah, no, I think that you should. I can connect you to someone who sends his kids to Alpha, but it's interesting. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, awesome.
Sweet. But no, I appreciate the time. I appreciate you coming on. I think there's some really good stuff we covered and insights, and
I hope I don't ramble too much.
no, not
I mean,
at
I
all.
could talk forever.
Yeah.
But these are mostly things that are deeply grounded in my real life.
100%. And let's plug you again. Where can people reach out? What should people do? Who do you want to talk to? And we'll link everything and show infographics here wherever we need to. But
My ideal is that I want to work with founders who are coming out of sales or operations or marketing, who have spent time in an industry, and they're like, hey, I saw this particular problem, and I have contacts where if I can demonstrate some traction to solving this problem, it's actually not hard to sell a deal, right? You bring me like 5 of those relationships and a tiny amount of money, and like I will set you up with an awesome product that can scale. You can go get venture money after that. You can build a business, whatever. My business is StartupLandia.io on the internet, and I'm John Davison, JC Davison on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. At the Red Fridge Society, I run an event called Barrel Aged Notes, which is this intersection of jazz, Scotch, and entrepreneurial community. I bring people in for tastings. We're all
Nice.
kind of entrepreneurs. I also run not really a podcast, more like a Zoom-based firesides called CTO Talk, where I do a lot like what you're doing. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around what does it mean to be a CTO at like 0 to 1. It's like very different from being like CTO.
Is there
of a
one
large
this week?
company. Next week.
Okay, next
with Jesse Farmer, who was one of the founders of Everlane. He's super smart, very witty. He was my teacher at Dev Bootcamp, and we've stayed in touch over the years.
Nice.
So there's a lot of ways to interact with me. I'll buy you coffee if you're in Austin. I'm very snobby about beer, Italian pizza. I've lived all over the world. I know China, Japan, Italy, Afghanistan. I've seen the luminescent seas in the seas near Saipan. I can talk about all kind of stuff.
Nice.
And I think I'd say my final plug is that for anybody who thinks it's a bad time to learn to code, remember that like coding is the new literacy and you don't get paid to be literate, right? Literacy is what gets you to the table. And there's a lot of ways to easily develop that literacy. And just because LLMs can do it is not a good reason to not learn how to do it yourself. I still think that the value of coding is incredibly high. And in fact, I gave one of my developers, I give him hours we just make stuff, right? And he was like, oh my God, I just spent an hour doing what would normally take maybe 20 hours. But he's also a very senior level developer. He knows how to talk to the LLM.
Yeah.
So I'm not a mathy programmer. I came into this being relatively good at foreign languages. And if anything, programming is more about the conversation you have with the LLM, but you still need to understand the underlying bits and pieces. So if you want to know about that journey, also please feel free to reach out to me.
Nice. How many languages do you speak?
Italian, Spanish, and Chinese with varying degrees of sort of competency. I studied at the Dalian 语外语大学, like the Dalian University of Foreign Languages in Dalian, China, and I lived in Naples, Italy for 3 years.
Nice.
But honestly, like you only retain these skills if you frequently use them to solve
100%.
problems.
100%.
And so languages, I hate to say it, are probably going to become deeply obsolete by like virtual, like
VR, AR.
VR,
interfaces.
AR, and Apple's move with the earpiece was stellar.
Yeah.
I mean, like all this stuff is going to eat up. There will be no biological or dopamine feedback loop for learning foreign languages, even if it is good for your brain. There are many things good for your brain, but it will be very difficult to put in that time to learn.
Yeah. Sweet. But I appreciate you coming on. I think this was a great episode, and we'll link everything.
I think it was an awesome episode, even though I talk a lot.
And we'll link everything, share everything, but I appreciate the time.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.